Hello, everyone. I often like to think about this topic from the perspective of asking the initial question, how many people here like to eat? And the answer to that is almost all of us. And with that in mind, we're looking at local food in healthy rural communities. And it's to recognize that while we eat for pleasure, it's also a key component that contributes to our health. And as we go through today's materials, I think you'll see that reinforced along with the readings and the other videos that we're looking at as well. And as I think about local food, it's often worth thinking about the context within which we exist. And this first slide is taking me back to Tokyo, where I had an opportunity to visit earlier this past year, and was quite amazed at some of the experiences and the contributions that occur right within the city of Tokyo to local food production. And this slide really tells the story of a greenhouse that I visited, and this young man is the farmer, again in the midst of the city of Tokyo, who is responsible for the operations of this greenhouse. And what's also interesting is the way by which this truly local food was marketed. And they had a vending outlet outside the greenhouse where you could come and you put in your money. I think it worked out to the equivalent of $3 Canadian, and pick up a little bag of tomatoes, as fresh as could possibly be. In fact, after this young man gave us a tour, when we came back out of the greenhouse, there was a number of women waiting to pick up their supply of tomatoes, and were quite semi-irritated actually, because he had been busy giving me a tour as opposed to putting tomatoes in the vending boxes. But the point of this somewhat humorous story is the extent to which local food was being produced internal to the city of Tokyo, which I found quite fascinating. In fact, and I don't think it comes up later in my presentation, I was told by a professor that there are as many acres of agriculture within the city of Tokyo as there are acres in parks. So there's more land in food production within Tokyo than there is within parkland, which is kind of interesting. And you can see the internal production that's occurring inside the greenhouse in terms of tomatoes. So this week, in terms of our course, there's the videos and readings as per other weeks. We'll speak a little bit to the context of local food. We'll connect agriculture and local food and connect it to healthy rural communities. As a reminder, assignment 4 is due next week. The videos this week, and there are a number of videos, some of them are quite short, but encourage you to have a look. And myself, and another presentation I did on farmland preservation, which is from a planning perspective a real key component of how we ensure that local food is available into the long term through protection of farmland. Dr. Gardner and George McKibben again with us. And the 3 videos, I guess there's 3 or 4 videos at the end are profiled across the bottom as well. Professor Samina Raja, who is a wonderful speaker and done some incredible work in local food systems. A short video of 8 or 10 minutes, as I recall. And then 2 very short videos by Jackie Laporte and Chris Marshall, a minute or 2 each, showing some examples of local food and work that they've done in that area. And the presentation by Professor Leah Minaker from the University of Waterloo is also really interesting. Particularly, there's a component in it that speaks about policy options within official plans and zoning bylaws that I think people will find of interest. It's a little bit longer video, but again, well worth the time to listen to. Related to my presentation, also the preservation of primary agricultural land for farming, you might want to have a look at this report, Perspectives on Planning and Agriculture and Food Security in the Commonwealth, and some of that material is contributing to this week's session as well. The readings for this week include the PowerPoint slide deck and a couple of reports, one of which is this document on facilitating the agricultural and local food sector in Northern Ontario, a municipal toolkit that I worked with some of my grad students, which I think is really quite a fine document that's been pulled together. And then Samina Raja, again, in terms of the American Planning Association and a planner's guide to community and regional food planning. And we've restricted the number of pages just to keep the reading a little bit less. So I'm often posed the question, what does local food mean? And for many people, it's often based on geography. And a number of years ago, I posed a question to some physicians that I was speaking to on this topic. And I asked folks how many people would define local food as anywhere from in North America, and I had everybody stand to do this, and nobody sat down. Within Canada, a few people sat down. Within Ontario, quite a few people sat down, but there's still, within 100 kilometers, which is often a number which is referred to in terms of local food, But I also have people still standing within 25 kilometers, which is true. It is local food, but we also have to be thinking about how do we feed the masses of people that live within this country and globally as well. Now, recognizing that the total number of people within Canada, and this will come up a little bit later, that are producing food, the farm population is actually quite tiny in terms of the overall proportion of people. So we need to be thinking about, yes, local food. We also need to think how it ties into the global food system, because many of us receive our calories through that system, notwithstanding that we really do want to benefit and build the opportunity economically and from a health perspective of engaging with the local food sector. There's also a story for me, and this reflects, in fact, this is the farm that I was raised on, and my father would tell me a story of when he was a child. His father had an apple orchard in the back part of the farm, posted house, and those apples would be picked, and those apples would be put into barrels, and then they would be put on a train and shipped to the city of Toronto, which was about 100 miles away. And for me, that really is local food in a way that contributes to the urban economy, but also is connected to, of course, local people. But the distances were limited in terms of how far you could send fresh food at that point in time. Whereas today, we look at things a little bit differently, and we might think of local food as being anything that's available at a farmer's market. So for me, it's the definition tends to vary by people, it tends to vary by context, but certainly there's a component of geography, there's a component of proximity, and there's a component of your knowledge of that local food system as well. In fact, Samina Raja will often use the example, I'm just going to get this going again, will often use an example of her local food comes from the farmer that she knows, right? That she actually has that personal connection to the food system, which I think is really interesting. So local food, rural communities and access to local food, it's to acknowledge that there's some important differences with urban communities in a rural context. The low population density of rural communities we've talked about previously, the lengthier distances between retailers, which is speaking to how important it is to think about local food in a rural context, because for some people, and I may have previously given the example of the little village of Lucknow, 1,000 people, which does not any longer have a grocery store. And for folks living in that community to get to a grocery store, it's another 10 or 15 miles by car to get there. So lengthier distances between retailers, the rise of supercenters, and the impact on other food retailers. And that impacts rural communities in a really significant way, because it's one of the reasons why, for example, the little village of Lucknow will have lost their grocery store. The absence of grocery retailers and less choice in some communities. Education levels in rural communities is historically less than in many urban communities, and it impacts, and if we look at the literature, it impacts what we tend to consume and our knowledge on the food system, the importance of fresh food versus processed food as an example. Demographics, an older population in rural communities and what that might mean for food security, and income levels also tend to be less, which is to say many people living in rural communities have less disposable income to spend on food which may be fresh but might also be a little bit more expensive. So in terms of rural communities and the access to local food, we're thinking about proximity of agriculture and what that might mean, and we're thinking about things such as CSA agriculture, community-supported agriculture, and farmers markets, which are an important component of the food system in rural and in many urban communities as well. I have included this one slide, which is from our readings from week 2, actually looking at the social determinants of health. And this is odds of individuals in food insufficient households reporting poor general, physical, mental, or social health and multiple chronic conditions. The key linkage back is food insufficient households. And what it's telling us, and this is the increased odds in food insufficient households, 1 up to 3.5. So you're much more likely to experience much more likely to experience major depression if you exist and live in a food insufficient household. Poor functional health, poor fare, self-rated health, distress, multiple chronic conditions, restricted activity, poor social support. All of those are much more likely to occur if you live in a food insufficient household, which speaks to the importance of trying to address issues of food security and local access to food as well. Part of the answer to that question is also thinking about what will drive changes to agriculture in the next 50 years. I often pose that question to have a good discussion or debate around it. I'll invite you to think about that in terms of what might be some of those changes, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail. But again, we're going to do a little quiz to get you thinking about what are some of the realities of modern agriculture within this country in terms of how it might impact the food system. So, question number one, the number of census farms decreased in Ontario between 2011 and 2016, and the question is true or false. Many of you will have guessed the answer, but it's true. Between that period of time, the number of census farms in Ontario dropped by 4.5% from 51,950 to 49,600. And that's a trend that we've seen for many, many decades now since the end of the Second World War. Second question, in 2016, the Ontario farm population was 5.3% of Ontario's total population. Do you think that that's true, or do you think that that's false? And the answer is false. The Ontario farm population has been declining steadily and now sits at 1.4% of the total population, and in Canada it is 2% of the total population. So for the food that we consume in this country, that's produced in this country, it's coming from only 1.4% of the population engaged with it. It's quite amazing to think of, if we went back in time far enough, we would see that it's the majority of people involved in food production, whereas today it's a tiny, tiny, tiny proportion that feeds the rest of us, which speaks, in my view, to issues of maintaining the farm sector and sustainability and so on. Question 3, between 2000 and 2011, Canada saw how many hectares of Class 1, 2, and 3 CLI land, which is the Canada Land Inventory, which is a rating indicating the best farmland within the country, was converted to settlement areas. And there's 4 answers given for you. I will come to the answer, and the answer is B. Over the 10-year period, Canada lost 220,000 hectares of dependable agricultural land to settlement, and more than half of that occurred in the Windsor, Quebec City corridor. I'm also doing other research looking at this in a fairly aggressive way in terms of measuring the loss of farmland in this province, and in my view it's something we should concern ourselves with, because the best quality land in particular can't be replaced. We can increase production in some areas perhaps, but we can't replace the best quality farmland. And my other video that you'll be watching this week speaks to that in a lot more detail. Question 4, in the Niagara tender fruit area, in 1951, 53,000 acres of fruit, including grapes, were in production in the Niagara region. Today, there are how many acres? So 53,000 acres to 25,900, 98,700, implying a potential increase, 73 or 14,500, and the correct answer is 25,000 acres, so less than half, or about half of what previously existed. And worth noting, the Niagara region has been home to some incredible pressures for development, but it also has done, in my view, with provincial support, an incredible job of really holding the line, very firm boundaries in terms of urbanization pressures. Question 5, milk production, poultry and egg production in Canada is almost exclusively for the domestic market. How many folks that think that that is true, or how many people think that is false? And the answer is true, and it's really based on supply management. Milk, poultry, egg, and poultry production are supply managed, which is to say we try to limit production to the demand that exists in the Canadian or Ontario marketplace. And it's a sector which has been under attack, particularly with recent trade negotiations, but in my view contributes positively because it allows farmers to make a living on smaller operations. It contributes more to the local economy, and I think puts that food sector in a very different light than would be the case if it wasn't supply managed. Beef and hog production in Ontario and Canada, conversely, are not supply managed and are part of the international marketplace and subject to higher levels of volatility for that reason. I think I may have given this away earlier with my presentation, but within the city of Tokyo, and I invite people to look carefully at Godzilla, who's looking over the top of that building there. Within the city of Tokyo, there is as much land in agriculture as there is in parks, and of course you know the answer to that. It's true, more land in agriculture than in parks, while Tokyo has a population of 38 million people. And just to put a little exclamation mark on that answer, this is some of the intense stuff occurring within Tokyo beside transit corridors, roads, buildings, high rises, and you can see the density of development. These are likewise some pictures from Tokyo, and you can see food production happening adjacent to commercial activity. You can see food production adjacent to apartment buildings that exist here. And again, quite amazing to see the intensity and the engagement of the local population in that sector. So a question out of those 6 or 7 questions, how did you score? And it brings us back, having established some of the, and I invite you to think further about the food sector. And there's courses, there's lots of other material that you can write, that you can read, and certainly write about as well. But it brings us back to this question, what will drive the changes to agriculture in the next 50 years? And half a dozen key responses which are provided here, one of which is climate change. What will that do to food production in this country and globally over that period of time? What about peak oil, which is to say our food production today is incredibly reliant on fossil fuels. What does that look like down the road? Should that change? Population growth and food security. Every year, I think we had something like 80 million people to the planet's population. And what does that mean for food security? We clearly need more food as we have more people. We need to manage the existing food better. Waste is often reflected upon. But what about population growth and what does that do for food security? Consumer preferences, people's diets are changing. I was speaking to an incoming student who's going to be looking at cricket production. As crickets as part of our food system, or at least in a variety of ways they could potentially be part of the food system. Yum, yum. Local and provincial support for land use planning, what does that look like in the future? And we're seeing discussions about that in Ontario at this very moment. And what occurs in terms of agricultural production. And as I look at agricultural production, again, it's worth looking at a graph similar to this, which is levels of production, past, present, and future. And we can look at the past and we can look at the present and have this expectation that yields will grow, that production will grow. And the question is, what does the future look like? And in one hand, we might continue that trend line. Things like GMOs have the potential to increase production, perhaps. On the other hand, consumer preferences, things like climate change, peak oil, have the risk of significantly reducing production. And water use is a really good example. If we think of the Ontario food sector, how much of our production comes from California? And I've looked at some statistics which show that the extent to which aquifers have dropped in that part of the North America, and it really raises questions about the sustainability of that as a contributor to our food system in the decades ahead. All of which could lead to a really significant change happening, which might impact availability and how we approach the food sector. All of those trends, in my view, bring us back to the importance of local food as a healthy community strategy. It's more than healthy community strategy, but it's certainly a healthy community strategy as well. And if we look at local food production needs, the perspective from my point of view is that local food production needs to be viable from a producer perspective. And I think often we sometimes forget about that. There's regulations that might be put in place against towards agriculture, some of which are there intended and certainly do bring much benefit, but we need to be thinking about making sure that the farmer can make a living, or else they're not going to produce food. And that's why I go back to supply management and see farmers able to make a living, and I see that as a viable sector, and I think that's good. It encourages and supports local food production. So you might have your own perspectives on that, but certainly local food needs to be viable from the producer perspective, and also to recognize differing perspectives, that people will have different points of view on a variety of things. And I've just posed these here as things for you to consider, and you might want to engage with some of your fellow students in discussions about it. You know, is greenhouse production on prime farmland a good thing or not? Some people would say, well, we should relegate that to industrial parks, or we should relegate it to land which can't otherwise produce food, and people will have different perspectives on that. Here, there's a whole range of things that influence the food system, all the way from organic to non-organic. What are the benefits and what are the disadvantages of one system versus the other? Large versus small scale, people will have different perspectives on that. And often people will be critical of a large scale production, And yet, from an environmental perspective, sometimes large-scale production comes with some attributes as well. And I'll always remember an example. This was, maybe I'll go there for a second. This was a farmer who had 3 traditional bank barns in the Ontario context, which are the barns which are that were built 100 years ago. He had hogs in each of those barns, and the manure from those hogs was stored outside in manure piles. And every time it rained, clean water from the sky washes off as dirty brown water contaminated by manure. The neighbors didn't complain. In fact, I think they thought it was kind of quaint, these old barns being used in that fashion. And he replaced it with a new modern industrial-looking facility, and the neighbors went ballistic. But he had the advantage of knowing that in that barn, not a drop of manure, because manure stored in concrete tanks under the barn, not a drop of manure left the premises without his management expertise being brought to that. And you can see the advantage. In one instance, something is accepted and looks quaint, but is clearly causing an environmental issue. In the other instance, you've got a facility that stores the manure, and it's only applied when the farmer chooses to apply it. Now, there can be issues with that as well, but simply acknowledge that large versus small scale is an interesting point of debate that I encourage you to reflect on as well. Vegetarian versus non-vegetarian, lots of opinions in society related to that. Environmental issues, the perceived versus real impact, which really comes back to the story I gave about large versus scale. Large versus small scale, there's a perceived sense that large is bad. One needs to look at that carefully. What are the advantages of urban agriculture? And I've identified one specific with a smiley face, which is backyard chickens. It tends to be a point of intense debate that I've heard here within the city of Guelph and elsewhere in terms of, that's a humorous example perhaps to reflect on, but it does bring focus to the fact that agriculture is a process and an activity that may or may not be all that well accepted by people at a community level, etc. And GMO versus non-GMO, I've identified there as an example of something that might be another topic to look at. So why is local food important from a community planning perspective? I think is a relevant question for us to ask. And also to ask, why is it important from a farmer's perspective? Because I think there's attributes and benefits to both of those sectors. From a community perspective, I think local food is a way to respond to global issues. What do I do about climate change? Well, local food perhaps has a lesser impact in terms of carbon emissions and transportation of food across long distances. I would suggest that local food from a community perspective might be a future necessity if we look at climate change modeling. In some parts of the world more so perhaps than here. I tend to think that when we go to the farmer's market and purchase something which was local, it's fresh, it tends to be healthier, tends to be, at least I'm assuming it tends to be healthier, it's certainly not deteriorated over time, and certainly tastier. Potential environmental benefits of local food relative to non-local production, and certainly to acknowledge the economic development aspects. If we go to the farmer's market and see dozens, if not hundreds of people participating, it's certainly contributing to the local economy. And of course, as part of that local contribution, it brings local jobs to the table as well. And just local food and the presence of it. From a farmer perspective, there's a number of these which are repeated from the previous one, but certainly some key additions as well. Substitute labor for capital, which is to say it creates more employment. In the Canadian context, food production has become so reliant on large equipment and fossil fuels, it's tended to be, since the end of the Second World War, replacing people on the farm. Local food has the opportunity to have more people actually working in community contexts, in gardens and so on. In my view, it creates diversity and opportunities for young farmers, creates some new markets. A farmer can actually choose to make a living by contributing to that market as opposed to doing what my brother might be doing, which is selling corn and soybeans and wheat. It's a chance to actually capture a local market. Respond to global issues for farmers as it is for citizens. Connecting farmers and consumers, so it's a chance for the farmer to actually make direct linkages with consumers, and that comes with a variety of benefits, I believe. It also contributes to diversity in the local food sector in terms of employment opportunities and farm opportunities as well. And there certainly will be other items that you might identify. But I think all of these become benefits for the farm community, just as they are benefits for the community itself. This is a bit of a summary table of that previous materials. Reasons to be enthusiastic about local food from a healthy rural community context. it can become a coping mechanism from an agricultural perspective to deal with climate change and peak oil as an example. It can certainly be a response to global and other local issues. It's a chance to do things at the community local level. And it can be a chance for community development, which is to build economic viability and resilience within your community, contributing to farm viability, contributing to opportunities for young farmers, and contributing to farmland preservation as well. And certainly if we look at Tokyo, it takes us back to that whole notion of preserving farmland, even internal to the city. So there are some options for rural municipalities that people will be interested in. One direction is for rural municipalities to support the consumption and production of local food. And if you simply have a supportive mindset, then you can contribute to protection of farmland, supporting farmers markets as an example, and supporting on-farm activities or things such as roadside stands and on-farm sales are the kinds of things municipalities can support that contribute locally to the economy. Municipalities can make sure that they have supportive official plans and zoning bylaws, and the one reading this week provides further evidence of that. Recognizing local food as an economic activity, it's not just something which happens, it really is a contributor to our local economy. The health attributes, which have been mentioned earlier, things such as local food charters, which you can read about in more detail, but it's this notion of a municipality or a community saying these are the things that we want to achieve and can make a difference. And there's examples included within this report that I mentioned, facilitating and the agricultural and local food sector. This has a Northern Ontario focus, and I think that would be of interest to you. And space for community-supported agriculture. If you can find that space and allow people to contribute and support local farmers in that event, it is something municipalities can do which can be successful. I will mention some of my former students, for example, work in this kind of specific areas, these specific areas. So going back to the notion that the production of local food needs to be viable for the farmer, it's an interesting question. How do you make money farming in Tokyo? And I visited a professor at the University of Tokyo in the agricultural sciences sector, and he had this $5 answer for me, which was to say he had a friend who produced strawberries, and these individual strawberries would sell for $5 a strawberry. And I'm thinking, that's pretty incredible. You could make a living producing strawberries at $5 for an individual strawberry. And I believed him, but until I saw it in reality, I wasn't sure what it actually meant. So we were at the Tokyo Fish Market, and lo and behold, there are strawberries there for sale. This individual strawberry here wasn't $5, it was 950 yen, which is roughly $10. So the strawberry was sold wholesale by the farmer. Somebody else has bought them and is selling them. Granted, it is an absolutely perfect strawberry. My son, who was with us, had a real interest, and he's a foodie, and I mean that in an absolutely positive way, wanted to buy these 4 white strawberries, which were 1,350 or 1,380 yen, which is roughly $15. So say, for easy figuring, $4 a strawberry. And these were white strawberries, immaculately wrapped. And tasting them, they tasted pretty much like a strawberry. The point being that there are opportunities for this kind of production that's occurring. I don't want to leave you with this as the lasting image of food production in Tokyo. This is expensive, and it's to simply say a farmer can produce something, and if he or she makes it an exquisite in its appearance and marketability, they'll do well. I'm also taking this back to the tomato production, which also occurred within Tokyo, which seemed incredibly affordable to me, which was those half dozen tomatoes that we actually purchased for the equivalent of $3 Canadian. So it's just interesting to look at those attributes of the food sector in the city of Tokyo. So, and that's just a closer up picture of those perfect strawberries, in case you're going to Tokyo and want to purchase them. So with that, thanks again for listening and participating to the various activities this week on local food. Next week, we look at safe and affordable housing, and enjoy your week as you get through the readings and the videos.